Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today, instead of a normal type of podcast interview, we're going to have our first Legendary Investors Roundtable, and our two special guests are both returning guests. They are Jim Rogers and Doug Casey. Both of our listeners should know you guys very, very well. Let me summarize your two careers. You both are best-selling authors. You both have traveled all over the globe and been to nearly every country on the entire planet. And both of you have a very strong track record for success as investors in many types, markets, and asset classes. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me here today on the first Wall Street for Main Street Roundtable.
Thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be here. Good evening, Doug.
And good morning to you, Jim, although, as you noted, it's evening for me and morning for you since we're at the Antipodes.
We certainly are. Anyway, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, and for listeners, Jim's on his exercise bike, but he's gracious enough to give us his time, and I'm more than thankful for that. So, gentlemen, with our roundtables here, what we normally do with these is I'll ask a question, and you guys can just step up and go back and forth, and we'll direct it from there. Okay, with the first question, before we speculate about the future, let's talk about the past and financial history for perspective on the present, since both of you have read financial history extensively. What past financial panics and other times in history do you see that are similar to what is going on in the world now?
Well, this is the first time that I know of in recorded history anyway, when every major central bank is printing money at the same time and trying to debase their currency. In the 30s, we had beggar thy neighbor policies, but those were mainly tariffs and controls. This time, everybody's printing money. It's beggar thy currency almost. I don't think this has ever happened in recorded history. Doug, do you know of any time when it has?
I don't. I think that's an astute comment, Jim, and also a very disturbing one, because this has got to end for that reason much more badly than past inflations have, because even when countries like Germany in the 20s and in Serbia in the 90s destroyed their currencies, that was only a local thing, and foreigners could come in and supply capital and buy assets. But everybody's doing this, so it's really scary, I think.
Well, wasn't if I could interject for a second, wasn't everyone trying to do this during the 20s, during the gold exchange standard, when during World War I, during and after World War I, when countries were trying to print more money and pay their bills, their war debts and things like that?
Well, they were all tied to the gold in those days, so it was hard to print money in the 20s. Certainly in the 30s, they went off the gold standard. Various people did, but even in those days, most people still psychologically did not believe in printing money. They grew up under different disciplines with different education, different mindsets. So maybe you're right, Jason, but I don't remember many people trying to print money certainly not in the 20s. America was still on the gold standard.
Well, I was talking about the gold exchange standard there, because then countries could hold their reserves. They didn't have to hold their reserves in gold. They could use dollars. Or I believe also British pounds, and then they could start, fractional reserve and start printing massive amounts of money then.
Well, I'd go further than that, actually, because the problem with the so-called gold exchange standard, I mean, these governments always cheat on it, and they say they're going to redeem the pound, and I think it was $5 U.S. at the time, if my memory serves me, and the U.S. dollar was $20.50. But they printed up more money, just hoping that nobody would run on the bank. The point I would like to make is that governments shouldn't be in the money business to start with. We don't need central banks. I mean, money is just a medium of exchange and a store of value. I don't see where government should insert itself in the equation. I mean, people should use whatever commodity they like for money. That's typically gold coins. I mean, the central banks should be abolished. They serve no useful purpose. Not economically, politically they do for the people that run governments.
Well, Doug's right, and historically, Jason, the world has been without central banks, and the world got along fine, and the world used whatever they wanted for money. It's only been in the last, it's about 80 years that people have been forced to use government money, paper money, up until the 30s. In the 30s, during the Depression, the British government made it an act of treason to use anything except the pound sterling as money, because before that people used all sorts of things. They could use, their own bank currency. They could use seashells. They could use whatever they wanted. So it was so ingrained in people's minds that money was whatever they wanted it to be, that they literally had to make it an act of treason to use anything else. So this has only been around for 80 years or something, where we've all had to use the dictated money dictated by various governments. Doug is exactly right. I mean, if you and I want to use seashells, we can. And by the way, Doug, silver has been used as money more than gold historically, because there was more silver and it was easier to find and more common. But
I think you're absolutely right, because if memory serves me, the Lydians in what is now Western Turkey were the first ones to actually coin money in the 6th century BC, and it was silver that they used. And, of course, that passed over to the Greeks, the Athenians, the obols and the staters, and that was all silver, too. So, yes, you're quite correct.
Yeah, and if I could add, before we start talking about money and competing currencies and things like that, which is our next topic, let me just touch a little bit more on financial history, for my opinion. I do see bits and pieces of studying the 70s stagflation. I do see some of those things occurring now. I do see, bits and pieces of some of the central bank and government behavior from the fiat money hyperinflation in France in the 1790s, where certain special interest groups demanded, to the people in power in the government that they had to have a certain amount of money printed to them and handed to them for certain social programs and these other things. And I think that's what I meant with my comment there about financial history, is that we're seeing a lot of these situations here where you just have the politicians, telling the central bankers that we have to have this money, and the central bankers are, I guess, essentially, since they're Keynesians, doing the bidding of the politicians.
I'll let you take that, Doug, first.
Well, yes. I mean, look, how does the state get money for what it wants? There's 3 possibilities. One is it extracts it directly from people in taxes. The second is that it borrows the money and issues bonds. And the third is that it prints the money up. So, I mean, this has really been going on forever. And regrettably, there's very few things that are productive that the state uses things for. I should say economically productive. They're politically productive for the people that are in office. And when things start going bad economically, one of the worst things that happens is that they often blame other people. Sometimes they'll blame people within the society, like the Germans blamed the Jews, and sometimes they'll blame people outside of society, and that means starting a war. So it's a bad circumstance. Government should be period.
Well, you're exactly right, Doug, and as I said before, it's only been in the last few decades that governments have taken this power. The people let them get away with it, because in the past they didn't. Yes, in the French Revolution, they printed staggering amounts of money. People learn. Let's just go down here to what was it called? The Revolution Committee or something, the Public Safety Committee or something.
Committees of Public Safety, yes.
Right, that's what it was, yes, which of course was the committee which was cutting off people's heads and taking assets, stealing from everybody they could. And then since they couldn't steal anymore, they just started taking money. But this has happened a long time. The Romans used to have gold coins and silver coins, and then they started debate. The term debase comes from the Romans, who started putting base metals into the coins, so the gold coins immediately disappeared. And then they started putting more and more base metals into the silver coins. At one point, the coins were 100% silver, and at the end, they were less than 1/10 of 1% silver because it was nothing but base metal. So governments have figured this out throughout history, and Jason, I assure you, they're figuring out ways to screw us all now. Governments all over the world, you see what happened in Cyprus. That sort of thing is going to happen in many other countries in the world. You see what's happening in America. The Europeans have now said, hey, wait a minute, guys, we can do this bail-in thing throughout Europe, not just in Cyprus. The Americans and the British have said the same thing. So be very careful. Be very worried and be very careful.
I always try to look at the bright side of things. And mentioning Cyprus, Jim, that stock market is down 98%. Now, it's true, it's just a tiny little stock market with only 100 ostensibly publicly traded stocks, but only about 20 of those 100 really trade, but it's down 98%. So I'm looking at the bright side. Maybe some of those stocks are worthwhile buying because some of them are selling for 10% of book value and have dividends of 8 to 10%. So maybe it's possible to profit from the collapse of Western civilization.
Well, it usually has been when something's down 98%. I haven't looked at it like you have, but certainly buying disaster has usually been a good thing to do.
Now, Doug, you also recently gave a presentation about the U.S. And the similarities between that and the Roman Empire to further talk about financial history. Could you summarize some of that, too, for our listeners?
Yeah. It's very interesting looking at Rome because the U.S. at its founding actually modeled itself on Rome. Everything from the buildings are done in the Roman style to the existence of an assembly and a senate, and our mottos are in Latin. There are really so many things. And when you model yourself after something, you actually do tend to resemble it. And unfortunately, war is a very big thing for the Romans. And it's a big thing to the Americans now, more than ever before. So, but all empires collapse, not just the Roman Empire, but before that, the Athenian Empire, before that, every empire collapses. And I kind of attribute that to a variation of the second law of thermodynamics, which is basically entropy overtakes everything. And the bigger and more complex and intertwined and interdependent a system becomes, the more energy inputs it needs, and it eventually collapses. And I actually think that the U.S. is approaching the state that the Soviet Union did back in 1990. I hope it's not going to be tomorrow morning, but it's moving in the same direction.
Well, there's certainly no question that it's becoming very corroded, just as the Soviet Union did, just as the British did when they were once upon a time on top of the world. Many other places, Germany in the 30s had a law that you could not take your money out of the country. Well, in the U.S. we have the same law now. You can take it, but you have to pay staggering taxes. So, a lot of people, we've copied a lot of people throughout history, and I'm afraid that Doug is right. I certainly hope it doesn't happen this week because I got a pretty busy week ahead of me. But it's certainly going to happen, and I'm afraid it's going to happen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I certainly hope so because I don't plan on dying in the next 10 years. So I hope you're right on both of our parts, Jim.
Well, gentlemen, there was a secret meeting, I believe, in the last week between, I think, 188 different finance ministers here in D.C. They all flew in. So who knows what's going on behind the scenes. Obviously, they're not really going to tell us anything until they want to, because, that's just how the central planners work. They only tell the politicians and central planners only tell the truth when it's convenient.
Well, I think it's amazing that these people get together and anybody really takes them seriously. They're they're just professional bureaucrats that could easily be working for the post office, except they wear $2,000 suits and people give them press conferences. I mean, these people generally have no knowledge of actual economics. They have no business experience. Look, the government tends to draw sociopaths to itself because government is pure force, actually, as Mao Tse-tung correctly said, and it tends to draw people that like that as a paradigm. So it amazes me and disgusts me that people pay attention to what these people are doing.
Well, but they have the gun. Remember what Mao Zedong said: "If you've got the gun, you're in charge," and
right.
They do.
It's not actually he who has the gold that makes the rules; it's he who has the gun makes the rules. So.
Exactly right.
But they still have to trick us though into consent, because then it's easier, right? That's what Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged said, right? It's just easier for them to trick us into a consent there to voluntarily give up all of our taxes and, be good little obedient sheeple like George Orwell so we can be milked, as cows, right?
Well, Jason, it's pretty astonishing to me that there was a survey done or a poll done recently, and very few Americans even know what quantitative easing is. Very few Americans have any clue about the debt situation. They just don't know. So in circumstances like that, it's fairly easy if somebody goes on TV with a nice suit, a nice haircut, and says, the sky is blue. Well, everybody says, my goodness, the sky is blue. They don't even bother to look out the window to see if it's blue or if a hurricane is coming or a tornado. So the problem...
That's a great point.
The problem is, not just America, but throughout history, politicians have learned that if you say something enough times, people believe you. I think Goebbels was one of the first who said, look, just say it over and over and over again, and everybody believes you, and then you can do whatever you want. So, I mean, this idea that you can brainwash people or tell people what you want them to believe. Maybe at first it sounds peculiar, but eventually, especially if they don't know, they never even heard of quantitative easing, it's pretty easy to get away with these things.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that, Jim, because they invented this term, quantitative easing, which is really nothing but the debasement of the currency, the printing of money, and they control the vocabulary. So people don't say printing of money or inflation or debasement of the currency. They use the enemy's language. He controls the argument. They say quantitative easing, like that's something different and better.
Well, they tell the press it's better. They tell the press it's different. And since the press usually doesn't really understand, the press says, quantitative easing must be good because the government told us it was good.
I know. They have these covers of magazines. Fortunately, most of them are going out of business today, but they have covers showing Bernanke as a hero and Greenspan as a hero, saving the economy and so forth, when actually it's the polar opposite.
Yeah, they're instituting the largest wealth transfer in the history of the world, right? Because inflation doesn't completely destroy wealth. It mostly just transfers it from, often the middle class or the people who used to have assets, who used to save, to the people who are the debtor and the government and Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera.
But, Jason, there are more of them than there are, right now, people who have saved and invested in the U.S., and I'll speak specifically of the U.S., people who saved their money, invested, did not buy 4 houses with no money down and no job. These people are being wiped out at the expense of the people who did buy 4 houses with no job and no money down. And the reason, Jason, is because there are more of them than there are of the people who save and invest. Now, historically, this has always led to a disaster for a country. You wipe out the people who save and invest, your country becomes a basket case, a disaster, both politically, socially, even war. So, no, this is going to end badly, but it's because there are more of them than there are of the savers.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And, I think it's interesting because Jim and I are speaking to you right now from the antipodes of the planet geographically. We're as far away from each other geographically as we can possibly get in Buenos Aires and Singapore. And interestingly, these two countries are as far away from each other in many ways economically as they can be, because correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but there's very little corruption in Singapore, and the taxes are 15%, 17, I don't know what it is, and the currency is stable, and here in Argentina it's chaotic. But I think we both made good choices as places to go. It just depends on what you like. And if I was going, actually my second choice in the world after Argentina, I like the wide open spaces. I like the estancias. I like the culture here. But oddly enough, I had to make a choice in the Orient, where you are, and Argentina, where I am. But although as different as they are, they both present positive alternatives to what's going on in the U.S. and, for that matter, in Europe.
One thing you left out, Doug, is the Malbec. I love Argentinian wine.
Because before we started this conversation, Jim was getting on his exercise bike, and I'm sitting here drinking a glass of Malbec.
Right.
It's also a big difference. So I tell you, I can't think of anything I've ever disagreed with Jim about. I mean, I feel embarrassed, Jim, but you're always right.
I'm delighted. If I were there, Doug, I would be drinking them all back with you. I assure you. And then we could head down to the disco or to the whatever, because the nightlife, all kinds of life in Argentina, despite the fact that they are a periodic basket case, certainly is very exciting.
Yeah, and it is exciting here. Not well organized like it is in Singapore, but exciting.
Okay, well, let's change topics. I think we covered a lot about financial history, and I think our listeners got a lot of value there. Both of you are outspoken proponents of competing currencies, so governments lack a monopoly on money and cannot inflate and still purchasing power. Do you think governments will allow competing currencies like Bitcoin, gold, and silver to actually ever compete against fiat currencies like the euro, pound, yen, and dollar?
I don't think that will happen until there's a crisis, or maybe a semi-crisis. Governments will not give up that power at all, and certainly not easily. But once there's chaos and people just refuse to take the money, such as has happened in other countries in the past, Zimbabwe, Germany, I mean, the history is full of that sort of thing happening. Even then, after the chaos and people stop taking or start refusing to take the money, then the government, once it can reassert itself, whether it's a man on a white horse or whatever, then maybe even a woman on a white horse, as in Argentina's case, then they will try
to... Or maybe Hillary in 2016, for all we know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, a woman on a white horse who will come in and say, I can solve your problems. There's always somebody who comes in and says, don't worry, I can solve these problems easily. Just listen to my easy solution. And then that person takes over, and then they will try to reassert the government monopoly on money. They may have to do it on a sound basis at that point, either backed by physical assets or real assets or something. In Zimbabwe's case recently, they just had to take a different currency. It took U.S. dollars. Ecuador did the same thing in recent years. But whatever they do, they will try and will reassert the government monopoly position. Unless it's just such chaos that they can't even get away with it. But that's not going to be a very easy world in which to live.
Yeah, I totally second that emotion. Look what the government did to, I think his name was Van Natten, that had the Liberty Dollar. They've, and of course they've taken action against Bitcoin and so forth. We need it's funny when I think about this. I become sympathetic with Vladimir Lenin. in some regards, I've got to say, when he said, the worse it gets, the better it gets. And as far as the monetary situation here in the West, it's going to be very inconvenient when the dollar collapses. But on the other hand, it will offer the possibility of a rebirth for at least a brief while until governments once again try to reassert themselves. I actually think that the nation state as an entity is on the verge of collapse. I think it might die and go away, and we might find a more intelligent way to organize ourselves in nation states. But I'm a veteran optimist.
Well, certainly, Doug, if you look at the map today and you see those lines that are drawn, most of those lines are very artificial. In Africa, they were drawn up by a bunch of white guys in Berlin in 1886 who'd never been to Africa. You look at Europe, most of those lines were drawn after the Second World War by victorious armies, and few boundaries in the world have any rationale other than some historical circumstance at a certain period of time. So there's no question that we're already seeing many countries change, break up. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Ethiopia, there are many places that are already starting to break free from those old artificial borders, nation-state borders. My view is that they were going to have more and more countries grouped around, the ethnic group, the religious group, the linguistic group, whatever it happens to be, because we all want to dance with people from our own tribe, rightly or wrongly. Now, I want to dance with everybody. I want to drink with everybody. Whatever they drink in their country, I want to drink it too. But rightly or wrongly, most people feel much more comfortable, dancing with people that they recognize or can get along with. So you're going to see more and more countries grouped around their tribe, for lack of a better term, than these artificial borders which have been drawn up over the past few decades or few hundred years.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the trend does appear to be, at least in that regard, in the right direction. And ultimately, I'd like to see 7 billion little sovereign entities as opposed to like 220 or whatever we have in the world today. So, slowly, maybe we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think decentralization is a key thing, but it seems, the people in power, the central planners, they're talking about, an SDR and rolling, all the problems and the debts up into one currency there if the dollar as a world reserve currency fails, and then, in creating even more inflation and, issuing this SDR out to countries for trade surpluses, basically just like what Keynes wanted with the Bancor.
Well, they may, when the crisis comes, they may get away with that for a while, but I doubt if that experiment's going to work, because it will be chaos, there will be inflation, there will be problems, and maybe you can walk into a country and say, okay, here's this piece of paper, and now you use it. That's going to be a hard sell, at least at first.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And something else, about Bitcoin is that the quote-unquote founder of Bitcoin, I think it's a couple of people or whatever, they're not taking any credit for it. It's a decentralized system. They've set it up basically so, one exchange can't be attacked. Like the predecessors, like Eagle, Liberty Reserve, and the other one, I think the Liberty Dollar that Doug mentioned, where the guy was printing, silver stamped coins and stuff like that. So, those guys, there was all one headquarter location, one founder, two founders that they could go after and say, these guys are money launderers or things like that. And I think Bitcoin, the founder smartly did not want to take any credit, and he created a decentralized system, making it almost impossible for them to fully shut it down without taking out the whole internet.
And incidentally, I've got to make a comment. You mentioned money laundering, and everybody seems to accept that as being an actual crime, but you may have gained the money in an illegal way, and not necessarily a criminal way, but an illegal way, and they've taken it to a second order, where now you have to explain where all your money comes from and so forth. So I would say that money laundering is a non-crime. It's certainly not a common law crime. But once again, your average chimpanzee now, since he's been told that it's a crime, accepts it as a crime. And personally, there's nothing wrong with taking money that who knows how money is gained and employing it legally and productively. And that's what money laundering is. So it's a crime, and it's a horrible thing to have everybody accept it as a crime.
And that's a good point, Doug. And nowadays here in the United States, if you take, $10,000 out of a bank at once, you're looked at as like a drug dealer, or, you're going to go pull a crime or something like that. You're stared down by people at the bank. You're talk with the bank manager. You're harassed. They mark your name down, all these other things.
I know. They just do what they're told. I mean, Americans are actually no better than the Germans were in the 1930s. They buy all this propaganda, and they do what they're told, and they'll turn their neighbors in.
And the definition of money laundering gets broader and broader and broader, every day. I'm sure that if you have a collection of baseball cards or something, someday they'll accuse you of being a money launderer. So
that's right, Jim. I mean, what is the difference between baseball cards and bitcoins? They're both stores of value in a way, and mediums of exchange certainly.
I don't think baseball cards are a crime yet, but who knows?
Careful.
Hey, I like baseball cards. That has a fondness towards my childhood.
Have a few baseball cards in your briefcase when you cross a border in the future.
All right.
They're going to be checking the authenticity of the baseball cards. They're going to bring in baseball card experts and for counterfeiting, just like Tide bottles and stuff.
Well, be careful. Somebody listening to this will probably start going and getting baseball cards, and we'll send him on a life of crime because
exactly, giving him bad ideas.
Right.
Yes, for listeners out there, don't take any Tide bottles from the Target shelves, and no using baseball cards for money laundering. Our next question, guys, how worried should people be about what is going on in the bond and currency markets right now?
Well, people should be worried about everything.
Yeah,
in all markets. What's the distinction? I mean, we've got this artificial sea of liquidity created by all these central banks printing staggering amounts of money. It's never happened. I don't know how it's going to end. Well, I do know how it's going to end. I just don't know when it's going to end. The risk to me at the moment is that, we now know that Congress has total unfettered freedom to spend as much as they want, and the Federal Reserve has total unfettered freedom to print as much as they want. Well, that can lead to a huge bubble in assets, and it usually has. I have been worried and skeptical, but now I see that they've taken all the locks off the doors in Washington, and people can do what they want. Now, this could lead to, we haven't had a bubble in the U.S. for 15 years or so, so maybe we're about to set off on another bubble in the financial markets. I'm not sure the bond market would have that much of a bubble. It's already had a 32-year bubble, or not bubble, but 32-year bull market. It may go on for a while longer, but I am not shorting stock markets anywhere because nobody has any constraints anymore. There's no such thing as sound economics anymore.
Well, that's right. I don't see much value in the world stock markets, notwithstanding the 98% drop in Cyprus. But I got to say, I think we are in a bubble when it comes to bonds, because interest rates have been dropping for over 30 years. You're right, Jim. And I think it is a bond bubble today. And actually, even more than the U.S., I think it's even a bigger bond bubble in Japan. I can't believe how low interest rates are, and they're going absolutely hog wild printing up currency there.
Well, Doug, as Keynes, he didn't get much right, but I think he's the one who said bubbles can last longer than you can stay solvent. And the Japanese bond market, you could have said this 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because interest rates in Japan have been under 1% for at least 15 years now. No, maybe going on 20 years. So you're absolutely, totally 100% right. Now tell me when I should short it, okay? Because if I had shorted it...
I'm not that brave. I wouldn't dare to do that. I guess, to tell you the truth, I actually, even at $1,300, where it's not like a giveaway anymore like it was at $300 12 years ago or 10 years ago, when it was actually in real terms cheaper than it was at $35. But I buy gold coins all the time. I can't help myself. I don't know what else to do.
Well, there are other things you can do. Buy sugar, buy a farm. I mean, there you are in Argentina. I don't want to put money in Argentina because they'll trap you or trap your money, but they'll trap you in most countries. So don't think I'm picking on Argentina. But I'm not I own gold. I've never sold any gold. I've never sold any silver, but I'm not optimistic about gold at the moment because what's happening in India is possibly going to ruin the gold market for a while. Now, if I can stay solvent and alert, then maybe that will lead to the huge buying opportunity in gold again. But the Indians, I don't know if you know, just in case some of your listeners don't know, Jason, I will quickly explain. India is the largest buyer of gold in the world, has been until recently. Now China's eclipsing them because India's cutting back, but the Indian government is blaming all of its problems on gold. They don't take responsibility. No politician ever has. So they put on huge price taxes, tariffs, if you will. They're doing their best to make it impossible to import gold. They put restrictions on the banks. Things have gotten so bad that in Pakistan they made it illegal to import any gold, and in some parts of the world the French are putting restrictions on, the Germans. But in India, to stick to the point, they are doing their best to stop the import of gold. But worse than that, Jason, as you probably know, Indian temples have staggering amounts of gold they've accumulated over the centuries. Well, now the Indian government is going to the temples, and essentially what they're trying to do is saying to the temples, sell your gold. Now, if it's bad enough that they stop the Indians buying gold, who are the largest buyers of gold in the world, but if they then turn around and can somehow make Indians or Indian temples sell their gold, I mean, that's staggering to go from the largest buyer of gold in the world to the largest seller of gold in the world, if it happens. Well, you tell me how low gold will go in a situation like that. So I'm not buying gold at the moment. I'm waiting for opportunities in the next year or two. I can see plenty of fundamentals, artificial fundamentals perhaps, that could cause gold to go down, but I'm certainly not selling.
Well, I can't argue with that, Jim. That's an interesting comment you made about sugar. I do remember, this was years ago, and I got bullish on sugar at 8 cents a pound. It went down to 3 cents a pound. What is it trading at now?
It's about 16 or 17 cents.
Well, in real terms, it's pretty cheap then, I guess.
Well, the all-time high on sugar was 66 cents, so it's down 75%. That's just in nominal terms, much less real terms. So there's not much in the world, Doug, that is 75% cheaper than what it was 37 years ago. Sugar's one of those things. I'm friendly towards cattle. I'm not in the futures market. But we've got a herd down here of a couple thousand head that we want to get up to 10,000 head. And I like cattle also because nobody's made any money in them for many years. And it's still very hard to make money in them. And the Argentine herd, like the American herd, are like 50-year lows. I don't think people are going to stop eating beef even if their standard of living goes down. So I like cattle from a breeding point of view. That's a long-term point of view.
And that's a grass-fed beef, right? That's not the factory farm stuff where we see the evil stuff in the documentaries and you worry about how healthy the food is, right?
I can only tell you about my cattle, and they grow up on grass, and maybe in a very nice, mellow feedlot that I have, maybe they'll be fed corn for a couple, 3 weeks, not very long, and then they go off to meet their maker. So, yes, and we don't use antibiotics and steroids, and we don't feed them newspapers and things like that surprisingly happen in feedlots in North America.
But Doug, do you have chickens or pigs? Because there are other kinds of meat besides beef. We all know that beef is fabulous, but do you have other animals?
Well, I don't have the chickens or pigs. I mean, the people that are on my ranch have chickens, and they give me eggs, and they have pigs, and we have asados with them. But as you're aware, the growth cycle for chickens is really short, and for hogs is not nearly as long as it is for cows. I like the fact that, it takes a long time to turn around a breeding herd of cows because, the gestation period on cows is about what it is for humans, about 9 months. So it takes a while to build a herd. And with herds at 50-year lows, I kind of like those dynamics. They can turn around chickens real quick and hogs pretty quickly. What do you think of that, Jim?
Well, no, yeah, those are correct factual statements. I was acting as a curiosity more than anything else. I'm not in the chicken or hog or beef business. I eat all three, although fish, and I eat fish too, but, maybe fish would be an alternative because it turns out that the Pacific is becoming extraordinarily, damaged, polluted. The nuclear explosion in Japan, all that water and all that radioactivity is now spreading throughout the Pacific, and so all fish, in my mind, is suspect, or certainly will be suspect. So if you have a pond full of fish that are not radioactive, chances are you'll be able to make a lot of money. But I'm not doing any of this, Doug. I'm just passing on a few facts about what's happening in the world.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation. And when you talk about the Pacific or all the oceans, actually, it's perhaps a tragedy of the common situation that we're looking at, in that nobody owns the ocean, so people just go out there and clear-cut the fish. And I wonder if that's not going to be a disaster in the making.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Or the government bureaucrat gives out the license to the highest bidder, to the person who's gonna, do the most damage in terms of fish the most fish out, pollute the water the most, not let the fish, repopulate and make more fish and rebuild their population.
But when some of your neighbors start turning into day-glow because they eat a lot of fish, no matter what the governments do or say, if it happens, we're all going to be very scared of eating fish anywhere, much less from the Pacific. And I read, but of course I haven't documented it myself. I read that there's more and more radioactivity showing up on the west coast of America because of the oceans. And if that's the case, that means a staggering amount of seafood is now perhaps becoming radioactive. So
yeah, and there was plenty of entrepreneurs, Jim, who were willing to come to the aid of the Japanese government when this first happened, who had really good ideas, and the Japanese government turned them all down. They were more concerned with the message to their Japanese media that there is no problem, there is no panic, everyone stay calm, instead of actually, admitting there was a problem, getting the problem solved, having the entrepreneurs and the people with the right ideas to come in there and fix the radiation and maybe not, prevent all these other things that may or may not have happened. I don't know all the facts of the situation, but I know that, they're not telling us the whole truth of what's exactly going on.
That's kind of scary, but what really scares me? It's that with all these governments around the world being bankrupt, and likely many of them looking to find enemies, and many of them being very unstable, what really scares me is the possibility of some type of, at least informal version of World War III, where you've got nuclear blasts going off a number of places unpredictably, not even knowing who set them off. So there's all kinds of potential problems. It's perhaps pointless to think about them. There's nothing we can do about them, and it may never happen, but the possibility is out there.
Well, I would say more than the possibility, Doug. I would say the probability. Throughout history, when you've had shortages of raw materials, especially food, it's almost always led to war. Whenever you have a dominant power which is stagnating and going into decline, and there have been rising powers or power, they've always clashed. You see, if you look at recent decade or so, you can see that, it's a lot like the period between 1900 and 1914. There are all sorts of problems, realliances, taking regional, what are perceived to be regional problems, just as they were in the 15 years before the First World War. But I am not as optimistic as you that we're not going to have war.
Well, no, I agree with you. I'm just afraid that we won't just have little sport wars like in Iraq and Afghanistan. We'll have a serious war if the U.S. starts hunting big game.
But hasn't the U.S. government though created a faceless enemy like the war on terrorism, and then the other enemy is the polluters, right, who are forcing climate change and destroying the environment. Al Gore just came out on TV today on Yahoo Finance and said all oil companies are going to zero. We won't burn any more oil in 10 or 20 years or something like that, and their reserves are worthless.
I wonder if he's actually clinically insane.
The good news is Al Gore is going to zero. The oil companies may go to zero, although I would guess not. But we do know Al Gore is going to zero. So far, everything he said in the past 10 or 15 years has been totally wrong. So he'll go to zero first.
Yeah, that's right. You gotta look at the bright side. Entirely apart from the fact that all the big international oil companies are all second rate compared to the oil companies that are owned by national governments, who are much bigger in terms of reserves and everything these days. And they're the ones that are really going to screw up the oil fields, because they, like Venezuela and Iran, they don't produce for economic reasons. They produce for political reasons, and they make all kinds of mistakes. Anyway, that's a different subject.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I have one more question, and then we'll wrap up the interview. The roundtable. Miners, manufacturers, farmers, entrepreneurs, and inventors create the real wealth of society and grow real GDP. And that's how the United States flourished and was the most prosperous country in the history of the world. Finance is supposed to help these guys grow efficiently and flourish. Instead, finance, like government, has grown rapidly for decades and seems to be a parasite on the real economy, killing its host. Banks and finance grab a larger and larger share of the economic pie, and the bank's earnings, are a larger share of the S&P 500 total earnings. And many of trading finance does is just trading pieces of paper back and forth for no real economic productivity gains. Is finance dominance over the economy sustainable?
Well, let me say something. I'll say something on that. There's a lasagna chart that has been put together for some years that shows the percentage participation in the market. What percentage of companies are industrial, and how many are pharmaceutical, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that the financial companies, banks and brokers, things like that, are like 22% of the economy. And if you go back to even as far as 1978, they were only about 10% of the economy. And I'll bet, I've never seen a chart going back this far, but if you went back to like the 50s, I'll bet they'd be like less than 5% or 2 or 3% of the economy. So, yeah, that's absolutely correct in my opinion. I mean, this whole thing with money This has all happened since 1971, especially. So, yeah, it's going to end.
Jason, go ahead.
You said that, the guy in the tractor, they made fun of him, and the Wall Street banker, they thought he was a genius, but the shoe's going to be on the other foot in the next generation. I totally agree with you. You said that.
Well, I did, yes, but there are going to be many changes, Jason. Throughout history, we've had long periods when the financial types were in charge, and then long periods when the people who produced real goods were in charge, and then the financial types again. In 1980, oil, energy, was over 20% of the S&P, and you know the rest of that story. When I went to Wall Street in the 60s, a big day on the New York Stock Exchange was 3 million shares. I mean, that's not even a trade these days, not even a trade before breakfast. So, the world has changed. We had the great bull market starting in the early 80s, and now everybody wants to get an MBA. But in 1958, America awarded 5,000 MBAs. The rest of the world produced none. Last year we produced 200,000 MBAs. The rest of the world produced tens of thousands. At the same time, when there's now huge leverage in the financial community, even as late as the 70s, there was essentially no leverage in finance. I mean, they were mainly partnerships. Many of them were partnerships anyway, and even banks didn't have big leverage. And of course, now you have governments all over the world coming down hard on financial types. And what more do you need to know? At least as far as I'm concerned, in America, more people study public relations than study agriculture. All our farmers and miners, etc., are dying. The Colorado School of Mines, which used to be the premier mining or engineering school in America, maybe even the world, now gives MBAs because nobody wants to study engineering anymore. So the shift is coming back. We had it, with the 30s, we had the Depression and governments coming down hard, et cetera, et cetera. So when I went to Wall Street, only the idiot son went to Wall Street, which is why I went, of course, because I could see that I was the idiot son too. But it's coming back, Jason. We've had long periods. This has happened throughout history, so please, all your listeners should learn to drive tractors. I mentioned buying farms before. Agriculture is going to be a fabulous place to be as far as I'm concerned. And finance, all those people who got MBAs should hurry down to Texas A&M and try to swap their MBA for an A&M degree, if they can, before it's too late, because the world is changing.
Hear, 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 hear.
Okay, well, in wrapping this up, gentlemen, I just want to thank you very much for your time. We didn't get time to cover all of our questions. I still have a long list of some awesome questions, and hopefully I'll be able to get them answered on the next roundtable that we do maybe in a couple of months from now if you guys enjoyed this.
Well, I certainly had fun.
Jim's got to get back to pedaling, and I've got to get back to my Malbec, and 12 hours from now, we will probably reverse positions.
Well, maybe next time I can be drinking them all back, and you can be on the bike, and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, but before I let you guys go, Jim, can you please tell our listeners about your books, since I know you need royalties for your daughters, and then Doug, can you please tell our listeners about your books in case you research?
Well, my most recent book is called Street Smarts: Adventures on the Road and in the Markets, and Doug, over to you.
My last book is called Totally Incorrect, and it covers everything under the sun, and my dogs and horses would be grateful for the royalties.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, gentlemen, and hopefully I'll speak with you guys soon, and we'll have you back on for another roundtable soon.
And it's a pleasure to be on the phone with one of my favorite people in the world, Jim Rogers. And
likewise. So everybody should go out and buy Doug's book, so he can buy them all. He can buy them all back next time.
Jim's book.